The Tower of Babel. It's one of the most well-known Bible stories of the Torah, the Pentateuch, but is what we commonly know of as the Tower of Babel Bible story. Is that really what's happening in the story? Or is there something a lot deeper at play? So according to the wisdom of Kabbalah, the Tower of Babel Bible story and other Bible stories, they all describe spiritual forces that interplay with the forces of creation, or forces of reception as we know them, in the creation of reality, the reality as we know it, and also the upper reality, which we still don't know, which is concealed from us, all in order for us to learn about these forces and how they operate on us, so that we can eventually come to attain them and attain the same spiritual perception that exists in that upper realm of reality where all these forces act. So we're not talking about corporeal people, places, objects, animals, and vegetations when we read these Bible stories, as we might commonly perceive them at face value, but rather we're discussing this interplay of spiritual forces, processes, and structures taking place in the spiritual worlds in their concatenation down into the creation of the reality as we know it into this world. And since these are spiritual forces, they're also omnipresent. The spiritual force from which everything extends is called the Creator. It's also known as God in these stories, as you know that word. And also the Kabbalists call it nature, meaning that the Creator and nature are synonymous, because it describes all one single force of love, bestowal, and connection, which created, which sustains our reality, which develops us at every single moment, which is omnipresent, and which is acting right now on your life, on the life of all people, on this world that we know, and throughout all the upper worlds that we can attain by the study of this wisdom. And that's what it is all here in order for us to learn. So through that lens, we're going to come and approach this story and see what's the spiritual meaning behind the Tower of Babel story and behind all of its events, such as why did God confuse the languages, why did he destroy the tower, and why people scattered from there all around the earth. We're going to look at these things from a deeper spiritual perspective, how the wisdom of Kabbalah describes it. It's Kabbalah Explained Simply. I'm Markos, and we're going to get into it right after this. So as with all the Bible stories, we always give this disclaimer at the beginning that Bible stories are written in the language of branches. Language of branches means that all these seemingly corporeal names, people, places, plant life, animals that we read about in these Torah stories, they all point to these spiritual forces and structures and processes that are taking place, which are, as we said, omnipresent forces of nature operating on our lives at every single moment, creating and sustaining reality, developing us at every moment. If we think of each and every one of our actions, behaviors that we perform in our lives today, all throughout history, even not just actions and behaviors, but our thoughts and our very desires, they're all under the operation of a single force that dwells in the roots of creation, which is concealed from our current level of perception. And the way that force acts on us through all kinds of filters, that's what these Torah stories, these Bible stories describe. So that's what we're learning about, as you can see here in the diagram, that there's some infinite force out there, some force of eternity and perfection, and there's people who attained that force, and they wrote to us texts, these books, such as the Torah. All the Kabbalistic texts, the Torah being one of them, are written at such levels where they describe these upper spiritual forces. And they're all in order for us to invite and draw those forces upon ourselves and to use them in order ultimately to come to the attainment of those very forces and of that level of perception, which is called a spiritual perception, called the attainment of the spiritual world. So, with all the stories that take place in the Bible, in the Torah, all the way back to the 7 days of creation, through to Adam and Eve, Noah. So we can see here a general outline of this descent as you see here, the whole Torah describes this process of spiritual descent of the original, of the creation being in an original adhesion with the creator that created it, with that spiritual force that creates and sustains it, and then undergoing this process where the creator, that original source force of love and bestowal, which only wants to delight the creation, which has that as its sole purpose, so it gives it a boost of what's called this egoistic force, or a force, an opposite force of reception. So there's a giving force in reality, and it creates this receiving force in order to receive the delight. And then that desire to receive, which is called the creation, undergoes a process of development. And ultimately that process of development is growth of that desire to receive. And it goes through all kinds of situations. We learn about these situations as shatterings, meaning separations from that original force through wanting to receive for itself, coming back to all kinds of unifications with that force, where that desire to receive wants to give back and wants to connect back with the creator. So all kinds of interplays there, in short, between giving and receiving in the creation of our universe. And that all takes place even before our physical world, our physical universe as we know it, comes into play. But together with that, even though we learn about how these forces are acting even before our physical universe has come into play, so we can still learn from how those forces act on us at every single moment, and see how all kinds of events in history, and how all kinds of events even in our personal lives and even in society today, even when we look around us and in the world, how things are operating and running according to that same program that is described in these stories. So that's generally what we're learning about now. There's this descent of the spiritual forces in the creation of the universe and our world as we know it, which is what's described in the Torah. Eventually there reaches a point of exile, a complete detachment from spirituality, where we come into our current level of consciousness, which is called the level of this world in the wisdom of Kabbalah. It's a corporeal world, which is defined by us perceiving reality through our five senses of sight, smell, touch, hearing, and taste, as you can see here. So we don't know what's outside of our five senses, but we do know that our sight absorbs a certain filter of reality and gives us a certain picture, and same with taste and hearing and touch and smell. And in this little picture, which even scientists today have defined as how outside our senses there's this abundant amount of information, billions and billions of bits of information that our senses are interacting with at every single moment, but our senses limit this information greatly. And this process of filtering or limiting information that is constantly around us into this small package that we perceive of as this world, which is what defines this picture here, which is called this world in the wisdom of Kabbalah and in our lives, is the most self-serving information. So at every single moment there is this desire to receive pleasure, this desire to enjoy, which is working on us and which is drawing through these senses, ultimately working according to an algorithm of what's in it for me. How can I receive maximum pleasure for minimum effort? And that's giving us this picture of our reality at every single moment, which is the picture that's called this world. So that's our corporeal reality, which is run by this program of reception of pleasure for our personal benefit that we're constantly living and abiding by at every single moment. And outside of this, if we attain the upper world or the spiritual world and start perceiving what these texts such as the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, what they're describing, so that involves acquiring a new sense. You could say it starts from something like this here. It's called, in the wisdom of Kabbalah, a masach, or a screen. I'll just write here that we attain a certain sense called a masach, which literally translates to screen. And through that we're able to deflect or reflect these forces that are constantly working on giving us pleasure, but to give them back And by doing so, we enter into a certain amount of what's called equivalence of form with the Creator, or with that omnipresent force of nature, as we discussed, the force of love, bestowal, and connection, which defines the Creator. Equivalence of form meaning that the Creator's form is one of love, bestowal, one of only outwardly, selflessly giving for the benefit of the other, which in the Creator's case, the other is the creation, that desire to receive pleasure that it created. And so if we switch the intention upon our desires to be working in that same mode, so it's called that we attain equivalence of form with the Creator, and that the purpose of studying such texts, and in general the purpose of our creation, the reason why that upper force created us in this certain form of wanting to receive pleasure all the time, is to reach eventually the realization that in order to truly receive pleasure in a way which is eternal and perfect, as is the force of the Creator itself, so to do so we need to enjoy in equivalence of form with the Creator. We need to enjoy in a way where we enjoy not out of a way of receiving only for our own personal benefit, because every pleasure that we try to receive for ourselves alone gets extinguished in that center point here. Yeah, it always fades away in there. But if we learn how to give the pleasure that's constantly coming at us back to the roots, back to the causal place where it comes from, so then we attain a much greater, wider perception of reality, what's called the perception not just of the upper world, but the upper worlds. And they have different names in the wisdom of Kabbalah, from this one being the world of Asiyah, through, we'll see them soon. Asiyah, Yetzirah, Briah, Atzilut, and Ein Sof. And it's not too important their names right now, but these are greater filters of reality, greater concealments of reality. The word world in Kabbalah, you could say in Hebrew, it comes from the word for concealment. World is olam in Hebrew, and the word for concealment is he'elem or alama. They have the same linguistic root, meaning that a world is a certain concealment, it's a certain filter of perception of reality. So while we're in this inborn perception and sensation of reality called this world, we study such texts in order to draw those forces from the texts, what's called drawing the surrounding light, and by doing so, it's all in order for us to come and eventually attain that same level of perception and sensation of reality that the Creator originally wanted us to attain, which is one that's in equivalence of form with Him, where we truly learn how to receive pleasure by receiving it in a way where we're also simultaneously giving it outwardly the same and acquiring that same identity, that same status as the Creator Himself, out of our own free choice. There's a lot in that. That's just a little bit about how and where we're situated in this picture, which is very relevant for how we approach these stories, because then when we get into these stories, we'll see how they're not just talking about some slice of history or anything that is detached from our lives, but they're relevant to our lives and how our lives are playing out at every single moment, how each and every one of our desires and thoughts are acting on us, and what we can do in the present to work with those desires and thoughts in order to equalize them in form with that original source force of nature that creates them and sustains us at every moment. So a little bit about this we'll get into before we get into the text itself of the story. Here's a text from an article, The Essence of the Wisdom of Kabbalah by Bala Sulam, Kabbalist Judah Ashlag, which is talking about what's called the law of root and branch. There is not an element of reality or an occurrence of reality in a lower world that you will not find its likeness in the world above it, as identical as two drops in a pond, and they are called root and branch. That means that the item in the lower world is deemed a branch of its pattern found in the higher world, being the root of the lower element, as this is where that item in the lower world was imprinted and made to be. That was the intention of our sages when they said, "You haven't a blade of grass below that has not a fortune and a guard above it that strikes it and tells it to grow." So what's being discussed here? So as we said, that when we acquire that screen, that masach, upon our desire to receive, here's two different ways of looking at it. That we, in our current level of reality, by receiving through the five senses now as we currently do, it's called we're in this world, You could also picture it here in the middle of these worlds here. When we acquire that screen, we start perceiving these upper worlds, what's called Asya, Yetzirah, Bria, Tzilut, and Sof, or you can see it here as concentric circles of a wider and wider reality that we perceive. And En Sof literally means no end, meaning no end to the fulfillment that we can receive, an eternal and perfect level of fulfillment, which is our ultimate purpose, to receive that. If we look even right now at every single one of our desires within us, each desire we have is a desire for pleasure, for fulfillment, for enjoyment, for satisfaction, however you interpret it, for happiness, for some kind of more positive state, something to make us feel better. We might interpret that in a corporeal manner for the time being, as desires for food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge. But when a certain spark of a spiritual desire emerges in us, meaning that we start asking about greater, deeper things in our lives, ultimately when we start asking about the question, what is the meaning of our life? So that brings us to the greatest, what's called doubt that we have, the greatest deficiency in our lives, something that is a much bigger abyss within us, causes a much bigger feeling of emptiness than any of our other desires. And when we truly start feeling a need for that and start seeking it and becoming what's called spiritual seekers, and eventually coming across the wisdom of Kabbalah and how to learning how to direct ourselves to get that question specifically answered in our lives, so then we come to learn how the meaning of our lives is ultimately to attain pleasure for that desire that wants to feel pleasure. Only that the way we can really feel pleasure is by not attaining pleasures that simply fade away upon their reception as we know about them throughout our corporeal lives. But when we attain spiritual pleasure, when we learn how to not just receive pleasure by inwardly receiving it for myself, as we do with all of our corporeal pleasures, for food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge, but when we learn how to acquire an inversion upon our intention and learn how to receive in order to give that pleasure outwardly the same way as the Creator or nature gives toward us at every single moment, and when we acquire that identification with and adhesion, what's called adhesion with the Creator, so that's when we acquire ultimately the purpose of our existence while we're here. All of humanity is being led to that, and when we study such texts, we get access to attain that much quicker than if we have to go through the process the way humanity does at large. So that's a little bit about this, and what did we just read about now in terms of the law of root and branch? So what we learned about is that there's that original reality that the Creator created, and then there's a stemming down of that reality by what's called root and branch, that each and every one of these worlds from Ein Sof, these describe spiritual worlds here. So each one of these worlds is like an imprint of a world before it, which acts like a stamp. And that's the law of root and branch, that the way the spiritual forces concatenate down into the lowest point in our reality called this world, which is the world we perceive through our corporeal senses, from that highest world, which is the most in equivalence of form with the Creator, the most bestowing, the most giving, the most acting out of a pure intention to love, bestow, and connect. So that stemming down is called the process of branching out from a root. And each branch, each world that comes about, acts like an imprint of its root. So why is that relevant to what we're talking about now? It's because, unlike other Bible stories that we've learnt about, for example, in the previous weeks, like Adam and Eve and the 7 days of creation, there are actually many parallels with the Tower of Babel in history. And we'll just say a few of them here, that an archaeologist, Robert Coldaway, discovered the ancient city of Babylon in today's Iraq, containing the ruins of a tower measuring 90 by 90 by 90 meters, or 295 by 295 by 295 feet. Herodotus, another historian, described the tower as a 7-tier pyramid of analogous dimensions. And various historical sources discuss the temple complex at Sagila, at the heart of which stood the Tower of Babel, dedicated to the god Marduk. It was called Etamanaki, which is Sumerian for Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. That place, Sagila, has also been known as a place that practiced lots of pagan rituals and beliefs, all kinds of things like astrology, numerology, date back to point back there in history. We don't dwell on these things, even though I'm mentioning just a few points in history. What I'm trying to point out here is that although these texts describe spiritual forces before they play out in our reality, there's certain events that take place in history and certain things that we can see in the Bible that do play out in a certain way in history, not one-on-one with how we read the texts, but there is a certain interplay in history. And what's relevant here is because it's the first time we're getting a social crisis that's coming about in one of these texts that we can refer to in this moment in history, and we can also refer to it as playing out the same forces playing out in other, you could say, times of social crisis in history too, which is what we'll also look at today. But as we said, we don't dwell on history because we're here to learn about the forces acting on us, and these moments of history that we can point to in some form or another is only as examples of seeing how those forces play out in our reality. So that's a long introduction to actually start getting into the story. So let's get into it now. The whole world had the same language and the same words. That's how the Tower of Babel story begins. What's this? That the whole world had the same language and the same words. So it means that originally, at the beginning of the story, there is this certain state of unification with that creative force, with the force of the Creator, with God, with the forces of nature that hold us together. There's a certain union there that can be expressed as a social unity, but not just a social unity, but one that's a unity where these forces of love, bestowal, and connection control or umbrella or envelope all the relations, all the connections that are being held by all the desires that are in that unity. So that forms the start of the story, that there is a certain level of unity that it starts from. Similar to how, you can even trace it back to how even in the original state where the Creator created creation, in the first very state, the Creator created the creation in this state where it completely filled it with pleasure, and the creation was adhered to the Creator, similar to how an embryo is adhered within the mother. So here it's something similar, that begins from a state where there's a certain kind of unity which is held together from that force of love and bestowal holding together that unity. And then, as you can see here in the diagram, there's a certain growth of desires that take place. You can really use this diagram as describing every single one of the Bible stories, that what's happening is we go from some small form of unity through a process of the desire to receive growing, expanding, what's called the growth of the ego, where at a certain stage of the growth of the ego, we start thinking that we can do something on our own, and we reach some kind of mistake in our calculation, meaning the creation that was created starts thinking that it can do something by itself, maybe in detachment from the Creator, even if it's with, you could say, seemingly good intentions, that we want to bring more pleasure to the Creator by our bigger ego. But by thinking we can do something by ourselves there, we enter into this form of separation from that original force of the Creator. The root of that separation comes from the breaking of the soul of Adam Arishon, which is described in the Adam and Eve story. We went through it a few weeks ago. I'll put all these other ones in the description, by the way, if you want to look back on the other Bible stories we looked at already. You'll find them in the description. So in the story of Adam and Eve, there's the sin of the tree of knowledge, which represents the breaking of the soul of Adam Arishon. It represents a certain stage of the ego's growth where a certain mistake took place in calculating that we could receive more for the sake of bringing good to the Creator, but we didn't know that would end us up in having a desire to receive with an intention to receive, which is opposite to spirituality, which shatters our spiritual connection and brings about this separation. But there's a purpose to all this. There's a purpose that ultimately it is the Creator, it is nature, putting up the egoistic volume knob here the whole time, and it's all in order for us to go through these states of separation Why? Because through those states of separation from the force of love, bestowal, and connection, which is the force of Creator, we can come to a higher degree of unity. And that's really what's happening here. The Tower of Babel describes, you could say, 1 and 2 in this process, and later on we come to a higher degree of unity in further states. And really, that's all that's being discussed here. If you really want to simplify it down into these processes. Another way of discussing it in the language of Kabbalah is that there's a certain descent that's taking place. Descent meaning a separation from the upper force. And this whole concatenation down of the forces from above downwards represents ascent and descent. So we begin the story, you could say, at a certain kind of ascent, that there's a certain connection to the upper force there. And then with the, as we said, with the volume getting turned up by the Creator on our ego, the ego starting to expand in us, we start making all kinds of calculations, and those calculations lead us to a certain separation from the upper force. Let's continue with the story. When they were migrating from the east, they came to a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us mold bricks and harden them with fire." They used bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered all over the earth." Okay, there's a lot in this excerpt. Firstly, this desire to build a tower with its top in the sky. That's the desire of the egoistic force, the desire of our desire to receive, thinking that it's having the audacity to think that through our own egoistic strength, through our own powers, that we can build something which overrules nature, that we can control nature with our own forces. That's this desire that emerges when it says the desire to build a tower with its top in the sky. So it's the desire of the egoistic force to overrule nature, the altruistic force. Also, what else can we see here? How else is that expressed here? It's expressed with this sentence here: "Come, let us mold bricks and harden them with fire." And they used bricks for stone, meaning that there wasn't even stone there. So you can see here that it's like this belief in our own technological means, that what we can create can even supplement for things that don't exist. Here we can say that since there were no stones, you could say that it's like there's no altruistic stones, there's no altruistic materials in this new egoistic desire that reveals. There's no means for reaching equivalence of form with the Creator, with the materials at hand, but we have to seek, and with this bigger ego that we have, we end up creating more egoistic means, like egoistic bricks, to come closer and closer to the Creator, because we've already detached in that level of egoism from the Creator. So we get this audacity to think that with our own technological means, with our own egoism, we don't need even stones. We can create our own by, mixing one thing with another, etc., etc. And through this process, and working hard in the process, because it also shows what kind of a hard work it is to build such a tower, and even make the materials when there are no materials there naturally. How much we're willing with our egoistic powers to exert in order to overrule nature. How such a desire is given to us from above, from the Creator, in order for us to, you could say, eventually we'll learn what it leads us to, that it'll lead us to a certain mistake in doing so. But it's all in order for us to undergo certain scrutinies to eventually come to understand, you could say, the error of going in the direction that our ego dictates us to go. Understanding and becoming aware of that error is called reaching the recognition of evil. That's the Kabbalistic name for it, that we reach a state called recognition of evil. And through that recognition of evil, we can come to correct our direction and go according to equivalence of form with the Creator. Go according to working to apply the force of love, bestowal, and connection upon our innate desire to receive. So we're also taking now from the Midrash, which are interpretations on the Torah, written a few years after that. This one's from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, because they go into some more detail on what's taking place here, bringing in such names as Nimrod and Abraham, which aren't in that original story there in Genesis. So Nimrod said to his people, we'll talk soon about who or what is Nimrod. Nimrod said to his people, "Come, let us build a great city for ourselves, and let us dwell therein, lest we be scattered upon the face of all the earth as the first people. Let us build a great tower in its midst, ascending to heaven, for the power of the Holy One, blessed be he, is only in the water. And let us make a great name on the earth, as it is said, and let us make a name." That's what it said in Genesis 11:4. So Nimrod is the king in the story, king at the time. Nimrod as well, in Hebrew Nimrod, comes from the linguistic root for the word mered, rebellion. So it's this king, this certain rule, this egoistic rule that emerges. Actually, Nimrod emerges as a king, his descendants from Noah's offspring, meaning that there's a certain descent of generations from the time of Noah's Ark, where again it reaches a certain level of egoistic rule, egoistic control. We see such rulers throughout the Torah stories. Nimrod's a key one. Pharaoh is a later one, and we see such kings, Haman, which is in one of the Torah stories. But anyway, so King Nimrod represents a certain kind of egoistic approach where it rebellion, meaning rebelling against the creator, rebelling against the idea that creator, that the laws of nature rule everything, but that it is in the ego's power to overrule nature. This is the kind of rebellion that Nimrod represents. And so it's said that in these midrash, it's said that the idea for building the Tower of Babel comes from this king called Nimrod. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had built. Then the Lord said, "If now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that no one will understand the speech of another." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the speech of all the world. From there the Lord scattered them all over the earth. So there's a lot here. What's happening here is, you can see there's a process of, if we go back to what we talked about in the Adam and Eve story, that there was this sin of the tree of knowledge, the breaking of this original soul of Adam HaRishon. It's called the breaking of the soul of Adam HaRishon, which first existed in Atzilut. And then that breaking goes through what's called a shattering into 600,000 broken souls, which are sparks from that original soul that was one and adhered with the Creator as the soul of Adam HaRishon, and it goes through this stage of these souls, or you could say these sparks, going through the concatenation down of the worlds from Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, down to this world eventually, a state of descent, a state of a higher unity with the Creator, going down to a state of separation. And so throughout this state of descent of these 600,000 broken souls, you could say that the Tower of Babel story is within here, that the descent takes place, and there are certain, you could say, descents and ascents throughout this whole process, even though that it's eventually leading to a great descent and a great shattering to a point where we end up in our world, in this consciousness that we know, that we perceive through our five senses. And so when we learn about this story here, we see that we started with everyone being in one language, and everyone was united in the beginning. And then what happened was, you could say that there's a certain united ego that arises, which is also talked about in this passage here. That it says that the Lord said, "If now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach." So it's acknowledging that there is a certain unification that they began from. As it said, the whole world was one language and one speech, that there's a certain level of unity. And within that unity, an ego arises, you could say a united ego arises and grows within them. And it's all programmed like this. It's all programmed from above that it'll take place like this. And also what's programmed from above is this next action that let us go down and they confuse their language so that no one will understand the speech of another. So it shows us that when a specific discernment in this Torah, in this Tower of Babel story, is that there is a united ego that emerges. You could say, think of it as a society all believing strongly in one idea, that with this idea they can arise and overrule nature, overrule the creator with this idea that they have. And that led them eventually to the creator coming and confusing their language, that since there is a united ego operating in them where they believe that they can overrule nature, eventually that leads to a further descent, further growth of the ego. And what's ego? The ego is the desire to enjoy at the expense of another. So you increase that ego more and more, and it eventually individuates more and more, and eventually that same people who are united start becoming divided. They start not, since they don't care about the creator and they're not inserting the creator, that force of love, bestowal and connection, into their relations, into their connections. So then the ego starts operating more and more, individuating them more and more, separating them more and more, and starting to them not just be a united ego anymore, but since they've separated from the creator and want to exploit the creator and no longer invite that force of love, bestowal and connection to themselves, so then they start operating also in a separated manner, and that united ego also becomes this individuated ego, dividing more and more, each one not understanding the other. How is that also expressed? We will go into this example now. So how is that expressed? We can also see such an example of a united ego and how it shatters through all kinds of examples in history. For example, Kabbalist Judah Ashlag, in his article The Peace, gives us a very succinct example of how that described communist Russia's rise in the mid-20th century and also its fall in the mid-20th century, purely because that he saw that here is a state where it's as if a nation or a state wants to establish this principle, which is ultimately a principle of love others as yourself, but doing it on the basis that it's in the name of a state, in the name of an ideology, a human-made or an ego-made ideology, that a certain state can arise and by itself start implementing these seemingly altruistic connections among each other. And Baal Salam talks about that since they created a setup which didn't connect with the source force of love, bestowal and connection, which didn't allow that original force to enter the relations at that level, so then it led to a shattering, because if you don't fuel relations for altruism and love and positive connection among people with the force that can actually enliven that connection and which can actually give us a perception of enjoying through the giving and through the caring about others, but while each one is naturally an egoist and prefers and prioritizes self-benefit over benefiting others, and then you try to, you could say, coerce a system of that everyone has to benefit others while each one naturally wishes to benefit themselves. So that's setting up the situation for a great shattering. And that's similar to what's happening in the Tower of Babel story. And here it's like a modern day example of these same forces playing out, this force of Nimrod, this force that thinks that it can overrule nature and overrule the creator, and where the ego can overpower the forces of nature, and then that eventually leads to a great shattering. So we're going to read through this article, The Peace. It's a few paragraphs here where it describes the whole thought and desire behind that creation of communist Russia and how it ended up falling, precisely because of the root reason that you cannot set up altruistic relations without inviting the force of altruism into those relations, because otherwise the motivation behind the altruistic relations will be egoistic and they're bound to shatter. And since not only will altruistic relations shatter if they're not fueled with that force of altruism that comes from nature, that comes from the Creator, but since you will create such a setup in society which seemingly tries to mirror something of spirituality while not establishing a connection to spirituality, so that shattering at the level of our world will even be much greater, because you seemingly make contact with a spiritual idea without fueling it with the spiritual forces, and therefore the egoistic shattering that results from that becomes much greater. So there's a parallel in what's happening in the Tower of Babel story here, or also with what's happening in the middle of last century. So let's just read about that from Baal Salam's article. History itself has troubled in our favor and has prepared for us an established fact sufficient for a full appreciation and unequivocal conclusion. Anyone can see how a large society such as the state of Russia, keep in mind that this is talking about in the middle of last century and the article itself was written then, with hundreds of millions in population, more land than the whole of Europe, second to none wealth in raw materials, and which has already agreed to lead communal life and practically abolished private property altogether, where each worries only about the well-being of society, has seemingly acquired the full measure of the virtue of bestowal upon others in its full meaning, as far as the human mind can grasp. Yeah, that's an important point there at the end. It's very similar to what we just read in the Tower of Babel story. This, as far as the human mind can grasp. The human mind is run by that egoistic program. So as much as an egoistic program that brings us all kinds of thoughts and ideas can grasp of this concept of bestowal upon others, can grasp about an altruistic principle. So that's what was set up there. Both, you could say the same thing about the Tower of Babel, that a certain egoistic idea of what it means to overrule nature became the viral idea among that people and led to its downfall. So, and yet go and see what has become of them. Instead of rising and exceeding the achievements of the capitalist countries, they have sunk ever lower. Now they not only fail to benefit the lives of the workers a little more than in the capitalist countries, they cannot even secure their daily bread and clothes on their flesh. Indeed, that fact puzzles us, because judging by the wealth of that country and its plentiful population, it seems unreasonable that it would come to that. Yeah, so they set up a situation where society would each bestow upon one another, and it led them, instead of some kind of flourishing, similar to what was happening in the capitalist countries of the time, it brought them the opposite, that they couldn't even secure their daily bread and clothes on their flesh, showing the immense amount of shattering that can occur, the immense amount of division and separation that can occur when you try to implement an altruistic principle on egoistic terms. Try to imagine if every person in that society were anxious to keep the laws of the Creator to the extent of the verse, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. And to that extent each would rush to satisfy the needs and wishes of one's friend in the full measure imprinted in man, to satisfy his own wishes, as it is written, love thy neighbor as thyself. Yeah, basically what he's saying here is, try to imagine if every person in that society, or if the society operated in a way of inviting that force of the Creator, inviting that force of love, bestowal, and connection in the relations of the people, where they would realize this, where they would get fuel to realize this key law, love thy neighbor as thyself. By the way, it's the key law of nature, where they say the laws of the Creator. The laws of the Creator, he also says in another part of the peace article, that they're synonymous with the laws of nature, which are ultimately laws of love, bestowal, altruistic laws, because the force of nature works in a pure altruistic bestowal mode to create and sustain the reality that it creates. So if everyone operated in a way where the benefit of society would be, in order to, as it says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might, meaning that the benefit of society would be also for the sake of benefiting nature, benefiting the Creator, where there would be this extra element in place, and therefore if we aimed to set up our altruistic relations in a way that invites the altruistic force of nature to come and fuel those altruistic relations, then we would actually get the pleasure from that altruistic mode that we insert ourselves into. But without getting that motivation, without drawing that fuel upon ourselves, then he goes on to say that it's like you're starting up a machine without fueling it with anything, and therefore the fuel is egoistic while we're trying to act altruistically towards each other, and then it creates a certain shattering. If the Creator himself were the goal of every worker while working for the well-being of society, meaning if reaching a state of bestowal and love purely and inviting that force into our connections, into our lives, were the goal of everyone who's working also for the well-being of society, meaning that the worker would expect this work for society would reward him with adhesion with adhesion with the Creator, meaning coming into that every work that we do within society would bring us to equivalence of form with that source force of nature, with that source force of love and bestowal that could fuel us into connecting with that, literally with that perception of all of our connections being filled and tangible with that spiritual force holding us all together. So the source of all goodness and truth and every pleasantness and softness, there is no doubt that within a few years they would rise in wealth over all the countries of the world put together. That is because then they would be able to utilize the raw materials in their rich soil, would truly be an example for all the countries, and would be considered blessed by the Creator. Yeah, so that would also, it's not just a matter of this country rising in wealth over all the countries of the world, but there would be no such goal to, with pride show, my country as being bigger and better than other countries. But since everything would be operating in a mode of bestowal upon others in order to bestow upon the Creator, so the country would become a beneficial organ in the full organism of all the countries in the world, because it would be inviting those forces to itself, and then it'd be felt as a positive influence among all the countries in the world. But when all the work of bestowal upon others is based solely on the benefit of society, without taking the benefit of the Creator into consideration, or you could say without inviting the force of love, bestowal, and connection to be this umbrella on our connections in society, to be something that fuels our connections in society, so then it's a rickety foundation. For who and what would obligate the individual to toil for society? And then he expands after that point to go on about the whole aspect of fuel and motivation for work, and how we need that, how we need to invite that altruistic fuel upon ourselves if we're going to establish altruistic relations, which eventually will bring us to an eternal and perfect state if we could do that. But if we remain with our egoistic fuel while trying to implement altruism, so then we are setting ourselves up for a shattering. Then the question becomes, what other kinds of societies can you think of where there's this united ego? Because we can see here from this Tower of Babel story and what we just went through with this elaborate example of communist Russia, that there's this message here of beware of a united ego, of you could say any kind of common idea, common grouping, where there's this idea of a bonded us, but it's an egoistic us. It's an us versus them. In the case of the Tower of Babel story, the them is the Creator himself, that the society led by King Nimrod, which is that key force of rebellion against the Creator, thought that since they were united and spoke the same language, then the egoistic desire grew in them, and they thought that they could overrule nature, overrule the Creator. But then it came to a certain shattering with communist Russia. It's a similar thing. Let's create a system, coerce a system where people will work for the benefit of society without learning what it means to receive pleasure through bestowing upon society. So everyone remains as egoists, and then it leads it to that system to a shattering. So you could even write in the comments, what are some other examples of a unified ego leading to all kinds of shatterings? We can see plenty of things in our world. What's this picture of these dark characters here? It's one of the first images that appears when you search for mafia on free image sites. So a mafia, a gang, is a classic example of a unified ego. If you look into several gangs and mafias and what ends up happening with them when everything starts going wrong, is that a certain unified code that exists there among the gang, that among the mafia, is shattered when all kinds of individual interests come into play, and then that original us versus them of that gang or that mafia, that crew, whatever you want to call it, and when individual interests start growing within it, so then it eventually shatters it, and all kinds of problems emerge as an outcome of that. What are we looking at here? Here's another little example we can see in our current era. What's this desire to go to Mars all about? Yeah, there's this very widely accepted idea and widely popular idea that since there's this increasing problems on our planet, whether it's climate change, global warming, overpopulation, that one of the solutions could be to move people or a certain portion of people over to Mars. And there's lots of funding going towards this. There's lots of popularization of this idea, lots of people supporting it. According to the wisdom of Kabbalah, moving to Mars won't solve anything. All the causes of these problems that we think of as being caused by other things in our world, like climate change, global warming, overpopulation. For example, according to the wisdom of Kabbalah, you can fit billions and billions more people on this planet if you know how to establish correct connections among the people, if you know how to invite the force of love, bestowal, and connection into human relations. So then you have an abundance of everything you need. What's lacking is just the correct connection among people. And instead of focusing on correcting our connection and improving how we relate to one another on the planet, we come up with all kinds of technological solutions to, for example, move people to another planet. And according to Kabbalah, and also what we learn from with this Tower of Babel story, so we can see clearly that such solutions aren't solutions, because we're just simply moving the problem to another place and spending a lot of money and efforts and time, and probably you can imagine there's going to be, in short, we're just moving the problems and our crises over to another planet. So that's another example of this same kind of idea, this idea which gains lots of popular support, which doesn't really lead to the solutions that those dreaming of it. In short, it'll lead to the same kind of crisis, even more of an downfall than what the current situation is that it's trying to fix. There's another part from the Midrash, I'm just getting into the last few minutes here, which we'll also read about. In relation to the Tower of Babel story, Rabbi Pinchas said, "There were no stones there wherewith to build the city and the tower. What did they do? They baked bricks and burnt them like a builder would, until they built it 7 miles high, and it had ascents on its east and west. The labourers who took up the bricks went up on the east, ascent, and those who descended went down on the west, descent. If a man fell and died, they paid no heed to him. But if a brick fell, they sat down and wept and said, 'Woe to us! When will another one come in its stead?'" Yeah, that's a very poignant example of how, with this belief in technology and how technology is going to bring us as a society to another great place, as you can see, the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar, it illustrates further what was said earlier in the Torah story about baking bricks and burning them as a builder would, because there were no stones, having this faith that our own man-made technology would be able to supplement for what nature provides us with. And then it leads to a state where we consider our own technology greater than human life, greater than the connections between us. It says, if a man fell and died, they paid no heed to him, but if a brick fell, they sat down and wept. So that's a clear illustration of how the relations between us and the connections shatter when our ego starts, when we start feeling that fuel from the ego more and more and more and following its dictates. Continuing this midrash, and Abraham, son of Terach, passed by and saw them building the city, and the tower. And he cursed them in the name of his God, as it is said, "Swallow up, O Lord, divide their language." But they rejected his words like a stone cast upon the ground. This is also significant because it brings in Abraham. Abraham, in Hebrew, comes from Avraham, the father of the nation. So Abraham would go on to be the one that would guide what's called the original establishment of the people of Israel. Israel too, it comes from the words Yeshar Kel, straight to God, meaning people who have a desire to move straight to the Creator, to implement relations of love, bestowal, and connection in society. This crisis of the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the peoples is what sets the scene for Abraham to lead the people who feel that social crisis of the time that was established from the Tower of Babel and its mistake, and who wanted to connect and who felt that there is this need to positively connect and to increase love in society in a place where the ego shattered all those relations. So that's Abraham. So it says here that Abraham passed by and saw them building the city and the tower, and he cursed them in the name of his God, said, "Swallow up, O Lord, divide their language." Another interesting thing here as well. Abraham is, as we said, the Torah stories don't describe physical people, physical places. Well, there might be certain parallels there, but Abraham is talking about one of these sparks. If we go back to this diagram we looked at earlier, this one of these sparks that originated from Adam Rishon, and as they're falling, so that spark which is rooted up here, it's called a spark, a point of Bina from above, or the point in the heart. That is what Abraham represents, that there's a certain point which holds a connection to the Creator. It's often very small. Even in the story here, you can see that Abraham doesn't have the strength to guide the whole of the society, which is fueled by the egoistic force, fueled by Nimrod's rule to create this tower. But there's this disagreement behind them, but he doesn't have the forces to do anything with that disagreement other than simply agree with the Creator. You see that Abraham's in complete agreement with the Creator. Swallow up, O Lord, divide their language. Same action that the Creator performs upon those following that Nimrod rule, those following the egoistic desire to overrule nature. So Abraham's in equivalence of form with that, is this small point that's in equivalence of form with the Creator. And you see that there's this rejection of his words from those with the egoistic desire to overrule nature. And there's this mutual rejection because Abraham is like the small point of that force of bestowal emerging within the great big desire to receive, emerging among the great ego. And there's this rejection between them. And at that point, those following Nimrod's rule, following the rule of wishing to create that egoistic tower that can overrule nature, aren't ready to accept the words of Abraham. So Abraham is like this, doesn't have the power yet to be able to implement any kind of bringing everyone to equivalence of form. This crisis has to carry out in order for people to feel and come to the recognition of that crisis that comes from the ruin of the Tower of Babel, when it's shattered, when the languages lead to everyone not being able to build it anymore. It comes to its ruin, it comes to scattering everyone across the world, and then people can start listening to Abraham's words, which comes later in the Torah. So Abraham, just showing it here, it's like a kind of a hub within this network that we all share, that we all have. All those who had points in the heart, all those sparks from that original soul of Adam Rishon. So Abraham, it's called a point of Bina from above. It's called a point where through connecting around that point of Abraham, it creates the conditions for what's called the people of Israel to come together, a certain group, a certain grouping of a certain strength of desire, which is equivalent in form with the Creator, that emerges after this whole story. And that's it. We're also starting to get late into the program now, so now if you want to learn more about the Bible stories, as I said, there's links to other ones that we've held here on the channel. I recommend the course, The Blueprint of Creation, which is a course in Kabbalah. If you want to learn these stories from the very first stages of the creation of our universe in the language of Kabbalah. So definitely check that out. There's a link to the Blueprint of Creation that you can check out at Kabbalah. And now too, right after this KES live, we're going to go to live Q&A. So everyone who wants to continue and I see there's lots of questions. If you want to continue and get your questions answered on this topic, or really if you want Kabbalah's answer to everything, so you're welcome to these weekly live Q&A sessions we also hold in Kabbalah, which comes with your Kabbalah membership. So check it out. Go and take that Blueprint of Creation course if you like this whole teaching of learning how creation is created from a single force and how it concatenates down to our world. So that's really where it all begins, in the Blueprint of Creation course there. And I look forward to seeing you after this in Kabbalah. See you later.